Hi, my name is Eleanor, and I want to tell you a story about grief. In case you're not sure what grief is, it's just a little word that we use to describe a really big experience. Grief is all the thoughts, feelings, and memories that happen in your brain and your body because someone you love has died. Grief can be scary, but I want you to know it cannot hurt you, and that is very, very normal. The first time I experienced grief was after my mom died. I was a grown up, but I was still really scared, like many of you. Sometimes I even thought my grief was like a monster. Not a mean monster that wanted to hurt me, but one that would pop up when I wasn't expecting it and make me feel sad, mad, or worried. Of course, monsters aren't real, but I was using my imagination. Anyway, after a while, I learned that my grief monster wasn't actually as bad as I thought. I've written a little story about it, and I'd like to read it to you now.
Because of Grief, I Have a Grief Monster by Eleanor Haley and Lisa Williams from What's Your Grief? Because of grief, I have a grief monster. He came to me the day my mother died, and he refused to leave. At first, I did not like my grief monster one bit. I was mad at him because I thought it was his fault my mom was gone. And I was scared of him because he made me feel really big things. I wanted to run away from my grief monster, so I tried to lock him in a closet, but he always found a way to get out. After a while, I realized that no matter how hard I tried to forget about my grief monster, he wasn't going anywhere. So I decided to let him in, and once we got to talking, I learned we actually have a lot in common. We both really miss my mom, and we both want to remember her. My grief monster didn't know that missing my mom sometimes feels really hard for me. So I told him, and he said he understood. The truth is, grief monsters don't mean to make people feel bad. They actually feel a lot of the same things you do, but in a really big way. So sometimes they accidentally cause grief storms. Grief storms are when you feel a lot of really difficult feelings all at the same time. And sometimes they want to think about things when you don't want to, or talk about things before you feel ready. But they're open to feedback. Feedback means telling them how you feel. For example, if your grief monster always brings up memories of your loved one when you're at school, you can say to him, "I will take time to think about my loved one when I get home from school, but right now I have to focus on my teacher." Once I understood my grief monster better, I let him go everywhere with me. Sometimes when my grief monster reminds me of my mom, I feel sad. But other times, I feel warm and happy. I like those times. In this picture, the grief monster is having a memory. He says, "You know who was nice to shop with? Mom." For a long time, I thought I was the only one walking around with a grief monster. But then I met my friend Lisa, and she told me she has a grief monster too. In this picture, Lisa's grief monster is saying, "I miss Dad," and Lisa is saying, "Me too." The funny thing about grief monsters is that many people have them, but you can't see their grief monsters until they tell you about them. Sometimes it takes a long time to realize that grief monsters are scariest when you make them live in the darkness. When you let them into the light, you often find that they aren't as terrifying as you thought. They just might need a little help figuring out how to be around you without always causing trouble. And sometimes they forget and upset you anyway. So it's helpful to know people you can talk to and ways to cope when your grief monster makes you feel sad, mad, anxious, lonely, or any other scary feeling. Grown-ups can be good to talk to, and they can also help you find coping tools to use when grief gets really hard. I wonder, do you have a grief monster? What does your grief monster look like? What does it sound like? When does it show up? Does your grief monster look like a mad monster, a scary monster, or just a really annoying monster who runs around being loud and stepping on your toys? Remember, this is just pretend, but maybe in your imagination you can picture your grief monster, and maybe you can even imagine making friends with it one day, if he promises he'll try to be good. This message is for grown-ups taking care of kids who are grieving. The reality of grief is that grief monsters are always with us, for better or worse. As kids grow up, they will re-grieve, which means they'll grieve for new things, they may come to understand their loss differently, and they may have new questions about their loved one and their death. Ideally, adults should open a dialogue about their loved one, the loss, and grief, and let kids know they can revisit the subject with you at any time. For those of you who aren't sure about where we're from and what What's Your Grief is, we are a 2-woman organization that provides grief support to people of all ages through online articles, grief communities, print resources, online training, and education. You can visit our website, www.whatsyourgrief.com, for over 600 free articles about all things grief and loss, and you can pre-order our book that comes out on September 27th. Thank you.